Hello, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. My name is Aaron, and in this show, my job is to defend capitalism and criticize socialism. Today, I've got a debate set up with a good friend of mine, Tam. He's from Scotland. He's one of my internet buddies, and he was gracious enough to agree to come on the show and have a little informal discussion slash debate. We'll have some back and forth about capitalism and socialism and which ideology we think is the best suited one to give the greatest amount of prosperity for the greatest amount of people possible, and why we think that is. Tam, welcome to the show. Thanks again for coming on. Would you like to give us a brief rundown of your ideology and what kind of socialist you are and things like that?
Sure, man. Well, as you know, and as you said, socialism can be pretty varied.
Yeah.
So I don't really use any one. I don't call myself an ancom or a Marxist. I call myself just a communist.
Okay.
I generally libertarian, for the most part. But in terms of from a socialist context, I think a state would be necessary for some period of time after any given revolution. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Which is typically the main
Yeah.
distinction between authoritarians and libertarian communists.
Sure. Do you feel like that sounds like it makes sense? I gotta say that I do like the refreshing perspective of a lot of socialists on the left who identify with the more libertarian aspects than the authoritarian aspects. I feel like there's a lot of similarities between them and myself, my anarcho-capitalist position, despite what seems to be like such a big divide in so many ways. So would you say it's accurate that you feel like maybe there would be some kind of minimal state? Let's say a socialist revolution happens. You think that there should be some kind of state involved in some affairs as it transitions towards statelessness or something like that? Would you like to see like eventually the state wither away after after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, definitely. Anarchists will say it should disappear immediately, and a lot of authoritarian communists will say, it should be essentially there almost indefinitely. I suppose my stance is as soon as feasibly possible, not at the risk of what we've already achieved, if that makes sense.
I got you.
I describe myself, I suppose, an anarchist at heart, but a Marxist in my head.
That's a good description. That's cool.
Yeah.
It puts the freedom part and the emotional, part there in your heart, but then you've got the logic of what I guess Marxism and dialectical materialism, in your head, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. So one of the things that I've seen a lot is when I debate online is a lot of people, a lot of the minarchist or anarchist leftists will tell me that you need to have government to protect private property, that capitalism requires a state. And then they'll turn around and say that they do want to, or not turn around, and then they'll say, on the left, we want the state to wither away after a certain amount of time or whatever. Now, I like to think about that mechanism of how the state would get withered away. First of all, of course, I believe that you can have private property rights in capitalism without a state. But what I see in terms of the mechanism of how to get a state to wither away, the capitalist would say, look, what you do is you start privatizing the state's functions. If the state provides electricity, you privatize the electricity grid. If the state controls the railways, you privatize the railways and sell them off. And that's how you wither away the state relatively peacefully and relatively calmly, right? Instead of burning everything to the ground or dismantling it or, destroying it, it can just be, the capitalist says it can be privatized and made to be competitive and made to have to fight for consumers and you know what I mean? Or fight for consumers, I mean like, compete in a marketplace, that kind of thing. Can you tell me, but if we have a socialist revolution, let's say, how would you picture the government, withering away, as opposed to privatizing certain government, ministries or entities? What would be the mechanism? How would that look, to see the government wither away bit by bit in a socialist revolution?
Well, let me put a disclaimer. I'm not the most well-read. I definitely read, but just in case there's an avowed, academic Marxist in his basement somewhere, in case he gets upset with me.
Yeah.
From my understanding, what matters is how a socialist state is formed.
Yeah.
Which, in my opinion, is the most vital to it, withering away. So, something that Lenin talks about is essentially the state becomes so democratized and so essentially pointless because the functions that the state previously took up are now governed by the people directly, that the state essentially stops existing. It's kind of, I compare it to how New Zealand got independence from the UK.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about
New
that.
Zealand, sure. New Zealand continuously were granted more and more autonomy from the UK just over time, gaining new powers for themselves. And at some point, the New Zealand government, it's more complicated than this, but effectively, they realized at some point, we are essentially already independent. Why don't we just go for it completely? And they became independent. And Ken, it's obviously a bit more complicated than that, but
yeah, but that's like the high overview.
It's when we say the state will wither away, we mean it almost literally. That as state functions become more democratized and directly controlled by the people, the state, as we know it at least, dissolves.
I see.
I'll be the first to say I don't think is a guaranteed method.
I think, that's true.
You've got to put effort into it and more thought into it, but that's the general, idea of it, I suppose.
I gotcha. Now, and that's an interesting example to use. I like it because I actually don't know much about the details of how New Zealand gained its independence from the UK. I just know on a high level that it happened at some point in the past. Did it happen within the last 100 years or something like that? It was relatively recent, right?
Relatively.
So and when you say when you use that example, another thing that I found interesting was how you said it would be more democratized, and New Zealand. It sounds like when you're saying the word democratized, it seems like New Zealand became more autonomous through that democratization, is what you're saying? Like it got more decentralized in a sense. The democracy just helped it act more autonomously away from the UK. Is that what you're saying?
Effectively, yeah.
So one of the things I think about when I think about decentralization is I think that I don't see any reason why democracy could not bring about decentralization. That sounds like it makes sense, but as you probably know, I'm not a huge fan of democracy, at least not on a large scale, not on a macro scale. Having like smaller independent democracies, I think, would be fine, because in that sense, when you have a bunch of independent democracies all acting autonomously, what I see in the big picture is a free market and the emerging of competition, in a sense. So, I mean, like imagine when New Zealand used its democratic power to gain independence from the UK. What you see is an increase in decentralization, right? Because now New Zealand has more autonomy, and in one way, there's, in a sense, more competition. At least when I mean, what I mean by that is, now someone has a choice to live live in New Zealand or live in the UK, and those two countries can now have different laws and rules and regulations and things for the citizens. So maybe, assuming that the borders are open enough and that people can travel between these countries or immigrate to either country, now you've got a little bit of a competition thing going on, like, well, which country is going to be better for me to live in as a consumer, as a citizen, So I like the idea of independence, of course, and the democracy thing, but what I see happening there in that example is an increase in competition and an increase in decentralization, like almost in a market sense. I mean, it's kind of loose because we're talking about states here, but that's what that's what I see. So I think it's true that you could have democracy bring about an increase in decentralization and an increase in choices for people, but in doing so, the democracy tends to tends to compartmentalize itself, because now you've got a separate voting body over here in the Pacific Ocean, and then you've got a separate voting body over here in the Atlantic Ocean, and they vote independently and they make their own independent choices, So I'm curious as to how I'm curious if there's any way to do it that doesn't involve any way to get rid of a state that doesn't involve decentralization in that regard, or splintering of democratic forces, But let me ask you something about democracy. When you think about democracy, do you want to see democracy like limited to individual workplaces, like everyone at the distribution center it owns only the distribution center, and when they vote, their votes only affect the distribution center, and so on, where the democracy is all, segregated among each workplace? Or do you want to see democracy in a big centralized sense where everyone votes together in one big vote, and then it affects, the entire economy as a whole?
Is
that a good question?
God, to be honest.
Or was that a crappy question?
No, it's fine. I don't think. I don't want to say I'm contrarian, but I don't think a lot of communists, leftists in general, would agree. It's either one or the other. But
you think maybe a mix of both? You could have some democratic functions that are like on a macro scale for certain questions in certain industries, and then maybe you have it decentralized into individual workplaces for other industries and other questions. Maybe you could.
Yeah,
sure, there's like a blend
sure.
of it.
I mean, it kind of happens already now. I mean,
yeah.
I'd see. I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Scotland and the UK as a whole, we have local councils, local authorities that oversee. For example, I don't know. Rubbish collecting the bins in a local area, and the autonomy could be expanded, which I would personally prefer. But I like to think of a state in this given scenario almost just like an elastic band, and all it does is hold these areas, these councils together, almost like the US, I suppose. How you've got independent states, but they're all united in a sense by the federal government.
Yes, that's right. And I see a parallel there. I think I see what you mean when you say that there's going to be local council autonomy on some scale and for some, civil functions and industries. And then, on a larger scale, you've got your Scotland and Wales and England, right? And then on a larger scale than that, like on a federal level, like you could compare it to, would be like the United Kingdom as a whole, right? And then in America, we have a federal government which controls all the 50 states and the territories. Then we've got state governments, which are limited, of course, to each of the states. And then after that, we've got, counties and cities and local governments like that, where we've got individual mayors. So, they send me ballot forms in the mail, and there will be questions on the ballot form that are just local to my city only. And then on top of that, there will be, they'll send another one with questions for the entire state of California. And then they'll send me another one that's got the questions for the federal level, like, you know, the president and all that crap, you know, who you're voting for. Of course, I never fill them out, but they send them to me.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. Sort of like America in theory, but, you know, much more democratic and open, because, you know, at the end of the day, the state does control everything that goes on in America.
That's true. Ultimately, they claim to want to control it. They do definitely make a lot of rules, despite the fact that the government allows a lot of capitalism to happen. You know, the government says, okay, these certain forms of capitalism are allowed to happen to this degree. It is the government that makes the ultimate claim of having the final word, the final authority on what amount of capitalism is allowed and what amount is not allowed. Now, you may disagree with me on this, but I believe that when the government is doing something or controlling an industry or setting some kind of laws like that, that what it's doing is just planned economics. And the less footprint the government has on the economy and the less direct involvement it has with production and the provision of goods and services, then the more capitalism happens, in my opinion. And then conversely, the more the government gets involved with stuff, then the less capitalism happens and the more, you know, planned economics is happening, is the way I frame it.
Yeah. I suppose that's quite a big distinction. Just first of all, even how we define capitalism, because to you, capitalism is free trade without anything, you know, prohibiting it.
Yeah, no, I define capitalism as free markets plus the allowance of private property rights. And I don't want to see private property rights mandatory. I just want to see them allowed. And that, to me, combined with free markets is capitalism. So you could have a worker-owned co-ops in capitalism that are democratically operated, but they're going to compete with other entities that may or may not be worker-owned. And there's going to be a price mechanism and all that crap. You know, that's the way I see it.
Yeah, which I suppose would make you just an anarchist. You just favor capitalism personally.
Yeah. That and that's the way I see it. You know, I see that anarchy is like the fullest expression of anarchy would be a free market competition, private property rights not being, you know, prohibited. And I recognize that there's other variants of anarchy than my own, but I do feel like mine is like the truest form of anarchy, I guess. Of course, a lot of leftist anarchists say that my version is the fake anarchy, you know, and that theirs is more is older and is the original. And it's like, yeah, well, you know, the sun revolving around the earth was the original astronomy, but later on we found out that it was the other way around. And so maybe now, you know, the earth revolving around the sun is not the original astronomy, but it's the most correct one now, is the way I see it. If we're gonna use analogies.
I know what you mean, man.
Yeah.
Again, I think it just goes back to personal definitions, and
yes,
you know, like you say, we all have essentially the same end goal. You know what I mean? The most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, ultimately.
Yes. Yeah.
But, I think it mainly comes down to definitions.
It does. Definitions, and that's true, because definitions control a lot of the premises of the arguments, and then from there the logic is usually pretty easy to follow along. I think a lot of the disagreements that socialists and capitalists have to do with definitions and premises. And
100%.
Yeah, right. And that's why I find a lot of socialists and capitalists, when they debate each other, I see that a lot of the logic, they'll argue about logic, but they'll argue less about logic than they do about definitions and premises, you know. And that's where a lot of it goes in terms of the debating. So, well, you heard my definition of capitalism. What's your definition of capitalism? Do you think capitalism is different than the way I define it, that there's more to it, or something else?
Yeah, me and don't know if it's, the Oxford Dictionary definition,
That's okay.
but from what I understand, it is the historical definition, which is essentially the private domination of materials and resources. Specifically things like housing and factories and what have you. I don't disagree personally with trade. I don't. I don't see why you can't, make, a loaf of bread, two loaves of bread, and then go sell one of them to your neighbor. I've got no issue with that.
Okay.
That's not what I understand capitalism to be.
Yeah.
If you were to ask me, do I disagree with being allowed to trade things and swap things? I'd tell you no. So, like I said before, it's just definitions.
Yeah. And you see that there's a problem with the private domination of capital and material goods and the means of production, and you see that as interfering with making society better. I is the way I take it, right? And you want to see more democratic and socialized common ownership of those means of production and so on?
Yeah, basically.
Now, earlier you mentioned that you have some affinity with libertarian thought, maybe left libertarianism. Do you feel like there's because a lot of socialists have told me, like, well, I want to see the state wither away, but in the meantime, I want to see a transitionary period. To achieve socialism, we need to have the state control things like, public goods like water and collecting the rubbish bins, and maybe generating electricity and public transportation. Running the buses, and maybe like housing. And then they'll single out those industries because those industries are kind of like more important, right, than luxuries or music or whatever. Do you feel like there's more room for private property rights or private enterprise in industries that are not so critical? Like maybe what about like luxury goods or music or movies or television? Do you feel like those are less critical to be socialized, and you just want to focus on seeing the like the rubbish bins and the housing and so on involved, in terms of government? Or would you like to see government involved in controlling luxuries and music and movies, at least in a transitional period?
My general stance is the state should, in the transitional period, the state should plan the economy up until the point that everyone's basic needs are met, and then beyond that, work out some sort of system for individuals to start their own personal projects. I'd still like if in some way they can still be based around socialist ideas. So, maybe you have to, maybe just one rule is it has to be somewhat democratic, but I don't see an issue with you as an individual hypothetically coming to whatever local authority and saying, I'd like to open up a cake shop as an empty building. Can I do that? Something like it's not finite, it's not concrete, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
I think there's room for it. It's something Lenin did as well in the USSR. He allowed, in fact, he promoted private industry on a local level in villages and towns and things to spur the economy. So it has its place. I can't say it doesn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not irrational.
Sure. and that's refreshing to hear. So it seems like your main concern is about people getting their minimum basic needs met, right? Which tends to be like there's like this minimum level that everyone needs in terms of food and housing and so on, just to live comfortably, or I don't know what you want to say comfortably, but live properly at a basic minimum standard. And then beyond that, everything's a little bit more up for grabs, I guess, is what you're saying. You know, once the minimum requirements are met for everybody, then beyond that, there's more room for like the individual autonomy and maybe room for private property rights or something along those lines.
Kind of, yeah. I've got a very bastardized view of communism.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, but you know,
Sure.
I'm a communist because I have my morals. I don't have my morals because I'm a communist, if that makes sense.
I got you.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm only a communist because I think it'll genuinely be able to bring people out of poverty. If I did, you know, if I thought capitalism could do that, I would be a capitalist without a doubt.
Yeah. So, and I find that one interesting too, man, is that I've heard a lot of people on the left say that they believe that getting people out of poverty is what communism or socialism is more equipped to do than capitalism is. And it is true that you generally, even though, you know, we both are sitting here saying we want to we want to see the most amount of good for the most amount of people, I will agree that you're less likely to hear a capitalist advocate for the poor than a communist advocate for the poor. You know, like it seems like communism has tend to have their hearts more focused on the poor than the capitalists do. I see this phenomenon. But at the same time, when I look at the historical record, when I look at the evidence, at least the evidence that's available to me through my Google search, right? What I tend to see is poverty goes down faster for more people in the places that have more respect for private property rights and more respect for free trade, and I don't mean like that necessarily in the places where there's less of a welfare state or less, you know, housing assistance to the poor, but you know, giving housing assistance to the poor doesn't make those people not poor anymore. It just gives them a place to live. You know, giving food stamps or electronic, in the US we call it EBT, which is like electronic benefits transfer, and what they do is the government gives out a card that, you know, you can swipe to get your food. It's basically a modern, you know, food stamp or ration book. But those things, even though those help people and put food on their plates, those things don't make people rich. They don't solve the poverty. They just help, you know, prevent people from starving. But if you want to reduce the ratio of people in poverty, economically speaking, the places that have the greatest amount of allowance of the free trade, you know, where the government has a smaller touch, a smaller grip on the economy, where it's not so heavy-handed and where it lets individual autonomy, you know, happen more freely. Those are the places where I think we see poverty go down the fastest, and where we see rich people grow as a percentage of the population. And you know, like the more rich people you have in society, necessarily the fewer poor people you're going to have, right? Every rich person you make is one less poor person.
Yeah.
So now you probably have been reading different articles and looking at different figures or something, and you probably don't agree with, you know, my contention there. But I mean, let me give you one quick example if I can. I'm sure you're familiar with Hong Kong and how it used to be a British colony, and then, you know, the UK handed it over to China in the 90s.
Yeah.
But now when Hong Kong was first a British colony, like, you know, like 100 years ago, right, back in the age of sail, the average person in Hong Kong made like, you know, less than 1% of what the average British guy earned back 100 years ago. But today, you fast forward today, because Hong Kong really focused on minimizing taxation, minimizing red tape, minimizing the prohibitions against, you know, capitalism and private ownership and blah, blah, blah. They let the banks do their thing, more or less, you know, and they let capital accumulate. They let financial markets, you know, flourish. And now what you see today is in Hong Kong, it may have changed with the recent riots and stuff, but up until a couple years ago, you know, Hong Kong, the average earnings eclipsed the average earnings of the average UK resident. You know, now the average Hong Kong worker is earning more annually than the average British person, because of Hong Kong having such a respect for private property rights and individual autonomy, that they eclipse. I mean, and now it's like one of the richest places in the world. I mean, I think they earn more than the average American too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah. But this is an interesting point. I've sort of got two points for it. First is what I would say is that because from a socialist point of view, China effectively is constantly on the ropes, if you like, trying to stave off global capitalism, if you like. And so Hong Kong being given the autonomy it does, because if it wasn't beneficial to China, China wouldn't give it the autonomy it has.
That's true.
So what I think personally is just that Hong Kong is used as essentially a way for capitalists on outside of China to have easier access to the Chinese economy. On top of that, GDP doesn't necessarily account for poverty rates. So if you were to Google right now, what are the poverty rates in Monaco, it would say 0%. But that's not because Monaco abolished poverty. That's because the rent prices are exorbitant, insanely high, and poor people can't afford to live there. And this is effectively what happened with Hong Kong. It happens. My family, in a sense, is a victim of it. We used to live in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and over time, more and more, without sounding Anglophobic, more and more affluent English people moved to Edinburgh, and gradually rose the rent prices and the housing prices until me and my family were forced out of the city
because of prices, right? It became too expensive.
Just constantly rising house prices. So that's what I would say, sort of, on Hong Kong, is that it's not necessarily because free trade, abolished poverty. It's that because all the poor people can't live there anymore. They probably were forced to move back to China, or maybe a few of them did find a good job and managed to stay and became wealthy in the process. But
that's an interesting counter argument. I like it though, in the sense that I like the angle that someone, instead of just everyone becoming rich, maybe some people became rich and maybe everyone else got pushed out of living in this particular place because of market pressures and because of rising prices and because their pay didn't keep up, and then they maybe had to move out. But and that's possible. I'm sure that happens to some people when a phenomenon like this happens, when a city gets richer, right? When a city gentrifies. But Hong Kong, I don't know as much about Edinburgh specifically, but I do know that Hong Kong, 100 years ago, Hong Kong had a certain population size and most of the people lived in poverty, and then you fast forward 100 years and the population of Hong Kong has grown, so there's more people on it now, and the poverty level went down. So even if some people got pushed out because of pricing, I'd say I haven't done the math on this specifically, but just remembering the numbers that I remember, it would seem to me that more people took advantage of a rising living standard than did people get pushed out because of rising prices that made it too expensive for them. You know what I mean? And that's what we've seen in America. We've seen in the USA, we've seen a lot of that too. There's definitely cities in the USA where people do get priced out. I live in Los Angeles, which is one of those cities that I'm sure you've read headlines about housing prices going up in Los Angeles and all over California, and a lot of the big cities in the US, the prices have gone up. But even though people do get pushed out, another fact of the matter is that in LA, in Los Angeles, some people get pushed out, but a lot of people just are making more money, and they're driving nicer cars, and they're putting second floors on their houses, and they're buying a second house. They're buying a vacation house, maybe in Colorado or Florida or whatever. And they're making more trips, they're traveling more because they have more money to spend and all these things. But the living standards, are rising unevenly, but I'd say they definitely are rising,
See, I don't disagree. Living standards are rising. I suppose it's whether or not you can afford those living standards is the main question. You know, just looking at sort of general sort of stuff, I think it's about 1 to 2% of Americans make minimum wage, which is something like $7.25 an hour. Which 1 to 2%.
Yeah, it depends on where you go in the U.S., but that's pretty much that's what most of the wages is in most areas. The minimum wage is at $7.25 an hour, which is not much. What is that, like £5 an hour or something like that, right? Not a lot.
Yeah, something like that. But only 1 or 2% of the country is on that, and according to the U.S. Labor Bureau, that is mainly young people, sort of under 20.
Yes, that's right.
A hidden figure, which is not talked about, is how many people make in between the bracket. So because the minimum wage is different to the living wage. The minimum wage is just the legal federal amount, the lowest legal federal amount. The living wage is the calculated amount that is required to meet a certain standard of living, which is $15 an hour.
It's somewhere around there. It's in the big cities, it's higher, and then in the more rural areas, the living wage is a little bit lower. So, but yeah, there is a gap there between the legal minimum wage and what the living wage would be. The living wage thing, they usually calculate that like what it would cost to live on your own, or like rent an apartment on your own. A lot of people get roommates. A lot of people will work multiple jobs. When I first got out of high school, I moved into an apartment with a roommate, and we split the rent. It was a decent little 2-bedroom apartment, but technically I wasn't even making a living wage for Los Angeles. But because I had a roommate, I had enough money to party and buy booze and buy pot. I had enough money to go out to music concerts like frequently. I had a lot of money to spend on luxuries and just entertainment.
Is that not in effect sort of a localized socialism then? Split the cost equally,
Yeah, you know what we did is this is what we did. We did socialism on a micro scale where we equally shared the responsibilities and financial burdens of the rent of the housing. But then we were competing in a job market, and we were doing competition maybe on a macro level, because we had to go out and apply for the best job we could get. We have to deal with the wage price pressures based on supply and demand. Fortunately, at the time everyone was hiring, so that was pretty good. But we took advantage. I'll tell you what we did though. We saw like 6 different apartments when we were first hunting out for an apartment, and we chose the one that had the lowest rent, that wasn't like a total shithole. And but we had consumer choice there, we had competition there, and we had multiple apartments to choose from. And there was like, just in the city, LA's a big city, but there was a lot of ads for apartments. We went and visited the different places and got pricing and made a decision based on that price. That was us being able to take advantage of the price mechanism of supply and demand, of market signals, and we had apartments waiting for us, not the other way around. I'm not sure. You described Edinburgh as pricing people out, including your own family, which is unfortunate. I'm sorry that happened, but I do know that there is Stockholm, Sweden has a very strong system of laws to control rent prices and protect tenants and not let landlords get too greedy. And there's the rent control in the city of Stockholm is very, very strong. And what I've been reading is that they have a 20-year waiting list for apartments. So it's like apartments are affordable, they're just not available at that price. And it's illegal to charge more. So imagine, if you will, imagine if an apartment was like an item on a shelf in a retail store, and you're walking through the aisles looking at the shelf. And there's a law that says the apartment is only allowed to be charged so much money. So there's a price on the shelf, you see a price tag, and it says this apartment is available at this low price, but the shelf itself is empty. And the guy, the store owner or the employee at the store, you ask him, hey, this shelf is empty, when is this apartment going to be back on the shelf? I want to buy one. And he says, oh, we're getting a new shipment in about 20 years. Meanwhile, the price for the Stockholm apartment was lower than the price for the Los Angeles apartment. The problem is that they were all out of stock of the low-priced Stockholm apartments. Meanwhile, myself in Los Angeles, I walked down the apartment aisle at the apartment store, the proverbial apartment store, and there was like 8 or 10 different apartments for me to choose from on the shelf, and they were all in stock and available, and I just grabbed the one right off the shelf that I wanted, and I got it right then and there. So, having when it comes to important things like housing, of course, we do feel, we understand that there's an importance to having a roof over your head, and this is a critical, necessary thing that people need to live. But socializing entirely the housing industry would be, I think, a real big step backwards, as opposed to maybe just having a free market housing industry. And then if you have a minimal government that maybe has, welfare or housing assistance for people that need it, and that government is just, funding it through taxes extracted from a sales tax or an income tax or something. Even though that's not my favorite system, I think that would be a lot better for most people than to have housing, say, totally nationalized or totally socialized. If you abolish the pricing signals, the market signals in the housing industry entirely, then you get a severe shortage. You arbitrarily set the price at some low price that's appealing to the voters, and then the apartments disappear from the shelf at the apartment store, and now you're all out of stock. That's what I've see happening. What do you think?
I suppose my first point would be that that's almost precisely why I don't believe, just personally, that capitalism can't be reformed. Because what was it, Stockholm, Sweden? It is still a market economy,
yes,
even if it is highly regulated, which is it's still.
Sweden's very capitalist in a lot of ways. Absolutely, they got really heavy-handed in the regulations with the housing, the rental housing industry in specific. So it's a very specific subsector of the economy, but it's one that's near and dear to the hearts of many socialists, which is rental properties. And it is true that it's still technically capitalism over there in the sense that they allow private ownership of apartments and they allow landlords and so on. But the red tape and the regulations so severely restrict and blanket and smother the pricing mechanism that you get this huge shortage,
exactly. No,
yeah,
I completely agree. Completely agree. That's because capitalism, it requires the profit motive, and if there's not a profit that can be made or is allowed to be made, then you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, but let me ask you this:
Sweden's essentially trying to implement socialism while remaining they're trying to implement socialist social policies while remaining in a capitalist economy that can't work like that.
Yeah, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. So, and the profit motive, I'm curious as to your take on the profit motive. I'm guessing that I suspect that you're probably very disapproving of the profit motive in most contexts. And you did say something a moment ago that I agree with, and I want to just jump back onto real quick. Is you said, in a capitalist system without the profit motive, no one's gonna produce this good or service. People need to have a profit available to them in order for them to produce this good or service. But I would say, yes, you're right, but I would add, isn't that true no matter what system you live under? Like Tam, you're not going to want to perform work if it doesn't benefit you in some way, and that's true no matter what system you live under, right? I mean, you're going to want to focus your energy on things that benefit you, and of course benefit your fellow man. But you don't want to sit there and sacrifice yourself on the altar of your fellow man and have yourself personally suffer, right? You want the benefit to happen for everybody. So the profit motive is going to exist for you personally and for your whatever company you work at, even in a planned economy, right? Even if the economic planners don't want you to do it, you're still going to have that desire, won't you?
To an extent, yeah. I think this is maybe where a bit of a misunderstanding comes in.
Okay.
Communists do not disagree abjectly, to the abject concept of profit. Profit is objectively beneficial. It is objectively a good thing to get more out of less than what you started with. That just makes sense. It's how we evolved, essentially. So we don't disagree with making a profit. It's necessarily at what cost you attempt to make that profit, that cost being people's livelihoods or whatever, the environment, whatever your personal take is.
Yeah, I see.
And how that profit is then used afterward.
I see. Yeah. So it's more like a people over profits kind of argument, right? Where you're saying profits are important, but you have to weigh those against the cost or against who it's going to hurt, right?
Kind of, yeah. Keep forgetting the point I was trying to make.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
Yeah. No, sorry, man. Don't worry. So you could start, hypothetically, you could, start your own project, running a bakery in a socialist economy, and you can still absolutely work to make a profit. But if the profit itself is not your primary motive, if being a millionaire, whatever you want, owning a Bugatti is not your primary motive, then you can operate at a less. You don't necessarily have to be. Your company doesn't have to be constantly growing, which is something that communists talk about a lot, and how constant growth is a negative.
Sure.
Which is something capitalism does demand to an extent.
It does demand to an extent. I'll concede the point there that the communists make, that capitalism requires constant growth. But when I think of that phrase, constant growth, I don't necessarily think that capitalism requires that every enterprise continuously get bigger in terms of number of employees or number of properties owned or number of factories in operation, but it does require the growth in the sense that the entity, you can't just stagnate, right? You either grow and evolve or you die. There's no static.
Exactly.
And the growth can be different forms. It can be just the overall, it could be the accumulated wealth of the enterprise. It could be the constant growth could be increased efficiency of the production process, which can cause a lowering in consumer cost for the retail goods, and an ability and alongside that an ability to produce a greater quantity of those goods in a given amount of time. So while it does require growth, I'd say it's really that growth can take on many forms, and it's growth that is demanded by the consumer, and competition is what allows those consumers to enforce their demands on these entities, because without a captive consumer base, you have to try really hard to please your consumers, or your customers, or else they're going to go elsewhere, and that's how you're going to die, right? You stagnate and then you die. So if you're not improving and growing and so on, so that's why capitalism, like for example in the 80s, West Germany was, before Germany was reunited, West Germany was pumping out, Mercedes and BMWs and Volkswagens that every year had some cool new design feature. Every year they had a better stereo, they had a more effective air conditioning system, or they had a new engine that was more efficient for, in terms of fuel consumption, or they had new exciting paint colors and new exciting styling that consumers were just like, ooh, wow, these cars are great. And then meanwhile in East Germany, they were building the same static, Trabant model for 30 years straight with no changes or improvements, and no increase in options or features or technology or efficiency, nothing. So you got the 1981 Trabant or whatever year it was, and they produced it for 20 years, while BMW had improvements in every product refresh, which happened constantly. So when I think of that growth, I think that growth is going to be overall better than the stagnated planned economy where everything is set in a specific plan and it has to stay static in that sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, I don't entirely agree with the way the Soviet Union's economy was ran.
Sure.
I think maybe like producing the same car for 20 years. I think that's maybe more a result of state interference, if you like.
Yeah.
Of Stalin effectively saying, "Oh well, there's nice cars. We already making cars." Because Stalin owned like 8 Bentleys or something like that.
Yeah.
It didn't affect him what car was made. He already had 8 cars that were probably made by West Germany. But I don't think that innovation is a capitalist phenomenon. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's not exclusive to capitalism. I do like to think that I think the primary driver. Tell me what you think about this. And you're right. It's not exclusive to capitalism, but I think capitalism does the most of it because a free market a free market plus the allowance of private property rights is how you get the most decentralized and most competitive economy. And the more competition you have, the more driving of that innovation you have, because the more you've got to watch, BMW has to keep an eye out as to what Mercedes is doing, and Mercedes has some cool new feature. Well, now I'm going to sell less BMWs, so I better come up with a cool new feature too, right? So what do you think of that? Let me ask you, what do you think of that as competition being a driver of innovation? Do you feel like there's some other factor that would be better at better at driving innovation than competition is? And also, do you think that there's room for competition in your idea of what an ideal socialist economy would look like?
What was your first bit again? First bit of the question?
So sorry, man, I was getting kind of long-winded. So the first part is, I agree with you that capitalism is not exclusive to innovation, right? You can do innovation without having like a capitalist mode of production, but I think that competition is the strongest incentive for innovation. So do you feel like there's another way besides competition to drive innovation? And if so, what would you call that? And then do you feel that there's room for competition in your version of an ideal socialist economy?
Okay. Well, let's take SpaceX as an example. So people who like to simp for Elon Musk, they say, without Elon, we wouldn't have these cool rockets and all the stuff that SpaceX does. And as a byproduct, they say this is a result of capitalism. What I would say in response is that Elon Musk doesn't make the rockets; it's the scientists that do. And definitely, some people follow the highest paycheck, which is perfectly valid. I can't fault it. But I think a misconception with um, science, engineering as a whole, is that these people make obscene amounts of money, and they don't. In reality, they make fairly, they're not in poverty, but they make fairly modest incomes as a general rule. I'm sure people at SpaceX make good money, but my point is that uh, Musk isn't the one fueling this innovation. The innovation is already there. People people already want to contribute. People already want to be scientists and invent things. All Elon does is facilitate it. That same
Yes.
facilitation could come from
He helped
any
organize the labor, right? He helped, and when I say organize labor, I don't mean like a union, right? I mean he helped organize the labor
Yeah.
into the production of the rockets. Like
Yeah.
the scientists already existed. The people were already getting their rocket science degrees in school, with or without SpaceX existing. But when Elon founded SpaceX and attracted investment, he attracted capital investment from outside investors, and then he was able to harness all that capital because rockets are expensive. Even though he's making them cheaper, they're still expensive, and he was able to organize and bring together a diverse group of people. And when I say diverse, I'm talking like rocket scientists, metallurgy engineers, aerospace scientists, and he was able to have them all focus together on this single project and create these rockets that he's selling for rides on for profit, right? So clearly he did something. He didn't make the rockets, but he certainly played a very valuable role in the creation of those rockets, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, of course. I suppose my point is that his role could have been filled by anything, anything that isn't a private entity. Like you say, he sort of brought these people together and attracted outside investment from other people. Um, from a socialist standpoint, all that means is that the necessary capital is already there to do it. And all Elon did was put up a big sign and say, "Please give me money."
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? From, and I know it it comes down to different worldviews and things at the end of the day, but from my perspective, all that means is that the material resources were already there, and all that needed
Yes.
to happen was some authority or council, whatever, maybe in an anarchist sense, the people just decided to do it. But it just required, well, anything to just give them what they needed
Sure.
already existed.
And yes, and there doesn't necessarily have to be an Elon Musk figure to create a successful rocket company, although in my opinion it certainly helped. But I could certainly imagine a world where you have a bunch of rocket scientists and aerospace engineers get together of their own accord, and they'll form like a worker-owned rocket company, and they'll just say, look guys, we're forming a worker-owned rocket company, let's just attract some investment capital and start making the rockets, right? And maybe they could design and organize their, design the rockets and organize the construction of the rockets in a democratic way. But that would still be, that would just be a worker-owned co-op operating within a larger free market context. And that's perfect, but I'd say that's perfectly compatible with capitalism. Just like Elon Musk being the private owner of SpaceX is also perfectly compatible with capitalism.
Yeah.
But let me give you a quick example, though. Since SpaceX, I'm a big fan of SpaceX. I am a Elon Musk simp. I'm guilty, man. But so yeah, man, you're talking to
I'm
a
sorry,
total
man.
I know. So, but let me give you a funny story, okay? So before SpaceX, there was already another rocket company that was, I'd call it, you may not call it socialist, but I would call it socialist. It's called EADS, and it's the company that also makes the Airbus airplanes, okay? It's the big European rocket company, okay? Now that company is government owned. From what I've been reading, is that it's a government owned company. I think it's mostly owned by France, but it's owned by like a bunch of European companies, I guess, or a bunch of European governments, right? Now what happened was EADS. Now this is before SpaceX existed, before SpaceX was offering flights on rockets. EADS was already doing it, and what EADS was doing is they were offering to private companies rides on their rockets. You pay a couple $1,000,000, well, more than a couple million, but you pay millions of dollars, and then the government owned rocket company would launch your satellite into space so that you can broadcast your television signal or whatever to Earth, right? Now they were losing money on those rocket launches. What I mean is EADS, every time they launched a rocket in the sky, despite the fact that they were charging millions of dollars to these companies for the ride, they were losing money on the rocket launch, which meant that the taxpayers in Europe had to subsidize these rocket launches for these big rich companies that are launching their, cable TV satellites into space. Elon Musk came around and figured out how to do the same thing a little bit cheaper, and then so he started attracting companies to SpaceX, and companies started buying rocket rides on SpaceX rockets. But the difference was SpaceX was not losing money on each rocket launch. Now SpaceX certainly had unprofitable years, but like where the expenses were higher than revenue. But what I'm saying is that each rocket launch was profitable in and of itself. They would make money every time a rocket went up in the sky, where EADS was doing the opposite. They were losing money every time a rocket went up in the sky. So then what happened was EADS sent out like a press release or something, and they said, look, SpaceX is undercutting us on price. So despite the fact that we're already losing money on rocket launches, we are going to lower our prices to compete with Elon Musk's company. And then it became a big debacle because a lot of people were like, hey, look, now you're just making taxpayers pay even more because the rockets aren't cheaper to launch. EADS didn't cut costs. They just cut, prices. And now the subsidies are greater for each rocket launch. So they made the problem worse, Meanwhile, the private companies are the ones innovating. Elon Musk learned how to, profitably launch a rocket into space and then make it land back onto ground and make it reusable. So the EADS is, in my opinion, that's publicly owned and democratically controlled. It's voters that elect representatives that then, appoint people to, control EADS. So maybe it's not your favorite democracy. It's representative democracy instead of direct democracy, but it's a democratically operated and publicly owned space rocket company. So yeah, absolutely, you don't need Elon Musk to launch rockets into space, and the capital's already there, and the talent and skill and technology is already there. But people like Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, all of these people got their rocket companies. Well, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic company in particular, right? He's doing the space tourism thing now, and so I know that Virgin Atlantic or some of those Virgin Airlines are losing money, but his Virgin Galactic Space Company is just about ready to start taking people into space and all this stuff. But what these people are trying to do is they're innovating, and they're trying to make rocket launching self-sustainable, as in it's going to make a profit. It's going to result in a net increase in value after, when each rocket goes in the air. Meanwhile, EADS, if you let them double the amount of rockets they launch annually, you're just doubling the losses. You're doubling the subsidies that have to come off the backs of taxpayers and so on. So yeah. It's a real instructive example, I think, to compare a private company like SpaceX to a publicly owned and democratically controlled company like EADS, because you're going to see the difference in the quality of the service that's provided. And by quality, I'm not saying that EADS has more launch failures or whatever. I mean, they make decent quality rockets, but the quality of the service, in the sense that you're actually creating a net benefit for society as a whole, rather than just making this infinite money sink that's just going to suck value out of everything, Yeah. And I'll let you talk now, because I just rambled for a long time.
Well, I suppose my first point might be that I don't know a lot about this other company you mentioned. I do know about Airbuses and that, and I know it didn't go quite according to plan. What I would say, though, is that it was likely an attempt on behalf of those governments to try and attract investment themselves into the country, and potentially artificially raise the GDP. Another another example, and I said it before. I don't love the USSR, but the USSR was successful in its space program, I
Yes, it was.
suppose.
Yes, it sure
And
was.
I
Yeah.
don't know a lot about it. I'm going to be honest. I don't know how specifically, they funded it and how it went. Um, but just comparing the Soviet space program to America's or even SpaceX, it's at least comparable. The Soviets were the first to send up a functioning satellite, and then a living creature, and then a human, and then um, around the
Hmm.
moon and back again.
That is true. I'll tell you something. I do know a little bit about the Russian space program, and it is true that that in the same way that you don't need an Elon Musk to send a decent quality rocket into space, that's proven true because the USSR was the first the first entity to send anything into space. They got there first, and but here's the thing about the Russian space program is that it was always a resource black hole. It was always sucking up resources and didn't. I mean, it produced some positive things, but it was a net loss overall. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian space program had to partially start doing things a little more capitalistically. Now it's still a government-owned program, but what they're doing now is they're selling rides on their rockets to the space station, to the International Space Station. And what's funny is
Yeah.
NASA, until very recently, NASA, the U.S. government space program, when they stopped using the space shuttle, NASA started putting all their astronauts on the Russian rockets, and they would pay to get a ticket onto the Russian rocket to go to the International Space Station. So it's like
Yeah.
and that those revenues. Now I don't know if the Russian space program is profitable or not. I'm going to assume not, but they do use those revenues
Yeah, probably
of the
not.
ticket sales to fund the program, right? So they started to have to compete in a sense. They had to resort at least on some level to wooing customers and selling rides and so on. So it's like they wanted the Soviet Union wanted to deny market forces and supply and demand and the price mechanism, but look who won in the long term. Despite the fact that they kept their program publicly owned, now they have to use a price mechanism. Now they have to compete. Now they have to try and attract customers just to sustain the space agency at all.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a point, man. I don't know enough about it to argue against it. I'll concede that.
No problem, man. No problem. Maybe someday, what I would like to see? I would like to see. And I'm not really a fan of NASA, the way it's structured and the way it's publicly owned, but I will concede that NASA and the Russian space program both did a lot of cool things in terms of science and technology. There's no denying it. Launching Sputnik into space and having it orbit the Earth, that was a huge feat. Putting men on the moon, that was a huge feat. Sending the probes to Venus, which the Soviet Union did, that was a huge, impressive feat, technologically speaking. But when it comes to the competitive aspect, I mean, what drove the innovation between the Soviet space program and the American space program was they were trying to compete with each other, and they were just competing. They weren't like really competing for customers so much as people that were like going to pay, at least not back then, but they were competing for customers in the sense of who was going to get who was going to be the most impressive, who was going to wow the most, viewers, who was going to wow the biggest audience, right? It was all about prestige, and they were competing in that regard, and that competition and is what fueled and drove and incentivized the innovation that we did see on a technological level, right? Both the USSR and the USA had a burst of space technology innovation in the 60s and 70s as they were competing with each other, right? And then they decided, okay, and then after the U.S. landed on the moon, it was like, oh, okay, they won. We're not competing anymore. This battle is settled, and then everything stagnated again, right? Then all of a sudden it's like, oh well, now we didn't go back to the moon again, and so it seems to me like that driver to make innovation happen and make efficiency improve and so on. You need those market forces. You need consumer choice. You need to have someone. There's a bit of redundancy there. Someone's doing the same thing that you are doing, and they're trying to do it better than you. And now you have to one up them. That's where the growth comes in. I think that I was talking about earlier. That's the way I see the growth. That's the way I see the innovation.
I think that internally. Not just competing with capitalist nations, but I think internally that can work in a socialist nation. I don't see why one company couldn't try and compete with another or something like that, And I think incentive in general is a lot less. It doesn't have to be monetary, you're incentivized by reward, whatever you value that reward to be. And it's like with a book, you don't read a book for any, and there's no real incentive behind it other than simply, turning the page or getting to the next chapter. You know what I mean?
The reward is the story, especially, right? Yeah. But I get what you mean about the book. The reward, when you read a book, the reward comes from the story or the knowledge that you get from it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or even just getting finishing it, turning the page. Personally, I feel like a level of accomplishment when I turn the page and I see the new number and I think, oh, I've come a bit further. And I think that's what humans are like naturally. We didn't. Arguably, there was no reason for us to incentivize past a certain point. We didn't. We could have stopped at feudalism or even the Stone Age. We've made a wheel and we can drive cows at 1 mile per hour. What need is there? Well, because we can do more and we can achieve more and we can learn more. My dad always sums up humans as we always have to know what's on the other side of the hill. And it doesn't matter at what cost that comes, we're going to want to know and we're going to want to expand and explore. I think this is why humans, at least more so now, are becoming more interested in space, because the possibility of going to Mars seems like a real one. It seems like something that could happen.
Maybe in our lifetimes. I'd like to see it happen, wouldn't you?
Hopefully. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And I don't want capitalists on Mars, but if I can see Mars, it'd be cool anyway.
Oh man, it's like, hey, we landed on Mars, hooray! Oh, but it was capitalists that landed on Mars. Oh no, stupid capitalists. It's
not the red planet anymore.
Yeah, it's not the red planet. Fuck, now it's the yellow planet. Well, I'll tell you what though. Even I can. From what I've seen read about the Mars colonization thing, there's an irony in it, because even if it's like SpaceX or Blue Origins or whatever, some private company gets to Mars, at least initially, the colony on Mars is probably not going to have much market forces or competition happening on there, right? There's not going to be much profit. They're going to be reliant. They're going to be totally reliant on subsidies from Earth, like food and water or whatever, and they're going to have to share stuff communally, and they're going to have to cooperate, right? And it's going to have to get to some size before competition and market forces can really start to take hold over there, right? Before it can, that sort of thing would have to be self-sustaining. And imagine just like you send 100 colonists to Mars and you say, now do capitalism. I mean, they'll probably all starve, right? Like, we can't do capitalism here. We need, support from Earth. Like, we need to work together,
Yeah.
And then I'll be like, God damn it, Elon, you betrayed me.
I suppose that's something that it's one of my issues with capitalism, is that let Elon Musk gets to Mars and there's 100 colonists and they're being subsidized by Earth.
Yeah.
Elon's primary motive is to get those people to be making a profit as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So his idea might be, oh, let's set up a mining colony and we'll set it up as soon as possible. Where the people who live there on Mars might not want to do that. They might want to engage in, I don't know, scientific activities, for example. You
Mm-hmm.
know, people on Earth might say, well, why not try and expand the the living capabilities on Mars as a whole, which would be beneficial to profit in the long run, but it still won't make it sustainable within a capitalist market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's, Elon Musk's uh, personal autonomy there is weighing the personal autonomy or wishes or whatever you want to call it of the colonists or the people with a personal vested interest back on Earth, or people just like you and me who personally want to see cool shit in space. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd prefer to see like cool big cities and domes as opposed to just
A
mines
mine colony. I know,
littered
right?
Mars.
It sounds kind
Yeah.
of depressing, right? Oh, the slave miners on Mars. They're trying to form a union. Those bastards.
The first Martian Union.
Can you imagine that? But yeah, it's interesting. A colony, when you're trying to go into a inhospitable environment like Mars, you can't just put a bunch of people there and say, okay, start making profit, right? That's not going to happen. At least not at first. It's going to be a money sink. It's going to be a resource sink at first because you're trying to establish this new presence where humans have never been before. But what are we going to do on what's the point of going to Mars right now? Elon says, oh well, in case Earth dies, then we got to have a second place, and I agree with that, but that's very long term, right? So how do you make Mars sustainable and make it so that it grows of its own accord, that it can be productive and so on? And at first it'll just be sucking up money, and it's going to rely on subsidies from Earth, and at that stage it's like the socialist communal stage or something. And then but eventually it might have maybe there's a mining colony, which doesn't sound too romantic, but who knows, maybe there's like a lot of gold underneath the surface or a lot of uranium, or maybe there's a lot of some really cool metallic alloy that we can find use for in our industries. And then maybe they find a profitable way to send these valuable metals and minerals back to Earth and sell them for profit. Now all of a sudden you've got like the best and fastest way to grow a colony on Mars, I think, would be to pressure it to become profitable, because that's when it's going to result in a net increase in a net growth of resource and value. And then before you know it, people on Mars, they might be like, well, we've got this, big now it's gotten to the point where we got this big valuable mining colony and we're producing all these, precious metals. Now we want more pay. Oh, the workers are going to unionize, and we want better representation. We want more pay. We want more resources, and, and so on. And then all of a sudden, and then they get it. Unions are okay in a market framework, absolutely. I just don't like it when they're mandated. But worker organization, that's fine, and they stand up for themselves. And then what I see as success is when Mars is making a profit and everyone there is driving luxury cars. That's when we know that our colony on Mars is really kicking ass and that we did something right. You know what I mean? If they're just going to be sweating away in the mines and be all dirty and miserable all day long and eating nothing but goop out of a bowl, I feel like that would be an example of the colony being kind of a failure. But but that failure would be lining up, coinciding with the colony being unprofitable and being reliant on subsidies from Earth. It's going to be reliant on the handouts from Earth just to eke out existence. So I think I think the profit motive is a good motive to have for any Mars colony.
It's not a bad motive at all. It's not a bad motive.
And we don't have to put profits over people. We can say that the profit motive could be made to coincide with making the colonists on Mars improve their quality of life, so that it could be, I don't know, I don't want to say people over profit, but it's like people with profit. I want to see like a synergy there,
Yeah, I mean, like I say, like I've got no issue with profit. I've yet to meet a communist who does have an issue with profit.
Yeah.
if it was evenly distributed or at least democratically, in a sense, appointed, then that's perfectly fine by me. Mars can be as profitable as it wants to be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I just fund. One of the main reasons I am a communist is just fundamentally, I don't want to hypothetically produce $60 an hour and then be paid. And I want
Yeah.
to have
Yeah.
uh, more individual autonomy,
Sure.
more individual rights over my own value, my own wealth that I create, even if it is on
Yeah.
the behalf of an employer.
Yeah.
Because I don't get to barter with my employer when I go for an interview.
Hmm.
And if I did, I'd be laughed out of the office.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I get what you mean though when you say, "Man, I don't want to produce $60 worth of value in a single hour for my company and then only get paid 10." Right now,
Mhm.
and I think what you're touching on there is the whole question of exploitation. Right now, it's quite
Yeah.
possible. Imagine like if you're working on your own and you're not using any factory equipment and you're just like you're working by yourself. Let's say you can make 5 pounds an hour working by yourself, and then but if you get a job at the factory you can make 20 pounds an hour, but the boss, instead of giving you 20 pounds an hour, he keeps 10 and gives you 10, right? And you're like, hey man, you just took 50% of my labor. But what the boss did was he gave you access to $1 million worth of factory equipment that exponentially increases your productivity. And the boss's job, or the factory owner's job in this case, is to maintain the equipment, or at least organize the maintenance of the equipment, and organize the distribution of the widgets that you make. He has to sell them. He has to market them. He has to calculate the correct price.
Sure.
He also has to keep an eye on the competitors. You don't have to keep. It's not your job as the widget maker to keep an eye on what the competitor's doing and come up with ways to innovate and so on. So really, what's happening in the way I see it is the factory owner is gaining access to your labor to increase his value creation, and synergistic, like symbiotically, you get access to his capital goods, and that allows you to increase your productivity too, and you guys are both sharing the exponential increase in productivity. Your productivity was increased fourfold. It's not like a linear thing, so you're not really getting you're exploiting him just as much as he's exploiting you. You doubled your pay, and he got a cut for his contribution, just like you get a cut for your contribution, right? And that's why we capitalists, we say it's not like a fixed pie. Like value isn't fixed. No one's hoarding the wealth. Wealth can be created or destroyed. It can go. The total amount of wealth in a given population size can go up or down. And when you allow these people, when you allow these these individual these individual combinations of labor and capital goods to happen in any form, you that's where you see the value creation go up. So capitalism allows that, where it's allowed where you can work at a factory you don't own, or you can own a factory that you don't work at. Those kind of things can happen. And when you ban those things from happening, when you mandate that everyone who works at the factory has to own the factory, and that you're not allowed to work at some place that you don't own, then what you're doing is you're limiting and inhibiting the kinds of interactions that can happen to create value. And that's why you overall, socialism can have growth. The USSR had some growth, right? They improved their lot somewhat, but the capitalists did it faster because the capitalists had the ability to do more kinds of interactions to create wealth. It wasn't quite as restricted. It wasn't limited to very specific lines. There's nothing wrong with having workers own the factory that they work at. It's only wrong when you mandate it. You know what I mean? And when you prohibit other kinds of work from happening. That's what I see as being like the bad thing. What do you think?
Work. I don't agree with the state giving you a job and saying that's your job. I don't like that at all. Um, the whole
Do you
Sorry,
feel
go on.
like there could be room in your system for a worker to make a conscious decision to contribute labor to an enterprise that he doesn't have an ownership stake in, where that is just one of many options for the worker? You know what I mean? Or do you feel like there's just no place for that? That he has to own it?
Well, I think an issue here is um, the ownership aspect. So, do you have public parks in America?
Yes.
Would you just imagine, a public park? It's effectively owned by no one.
Yeah.
Technically, no one literally owns it. But
Yeah.
in effect, because of that, everyone owns it and everyone gets access to it. And it is, managed by the state, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it's it's sort of a no one owns it, so everyone owns it. It's
Yeah.
less about the literal I own 5% of this company and more I am just as much of an equal in this workplace as anyone else at any other level of management. We all contribute to it, we all work for it. Therefore, I also get a say in some of its operation, even if that's just the workplace being democratic. Not every decision has to be directly democratic. I don't mind a representative democracy within the workplace. I think it'd get
Mm-hmm.
quite messy if it wasn't.
Yeah, there would have to be some
Uh,
element of representative democracy. Yeah,
yeah,
you can't have everyone voting on the purchase of every hammer and the creation of every widget,
exactly.
because you're just going to spend all day long voting.
Exactly, which some ancoms seem to think is how it will work, but it's not.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's, one of it's one of the biggest issues we have, sort of capitalism and communism debates, is how we how we understand these things. Um, Ayn Rand says it when she talks about the colonization of America,
Mm-hmm.
how um, the where the West, or the colonization of the Americas, introduced the concept of ownership, because before then the natives lived with an understanding that everyone owned the earth. It wasn't, and not, not to be all spiritual or whatever. I'm just making
Mm-hmm.
a point that some cultures have different understandings of how we interact with property and resources, and that's effectively what communists argue. Is we culturally view communists, the ownership of property, as different. So when we say, everyone at the fish factory should own the fish factory, that doesn't mean you're literally, you own 5 shares in the company
Mm. Okay.
necessarily. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So is there any room for? I mean, I guess if everything's publicly owned in commons, then like how do you do outside investment? How do you raise investment dollars to purchase capital goods and start a new innovative factory that makes rockets to space or whatever? If everyone is um, publicly owning in commons all those resources, I feel like it could get kind of difficult to distribute those things. For example, if you say, okay, we're going to democratically control the means of production on a macro scale, well, then the rocket factory will not get built unless at least 51% of the voters vote to build it and put the resources in there. Meanwhile, over
Sure.
in the capitalist society, you don't need a majority vote of all the consumers to get the rocket factory built. All you need is a sufficient number of investors to contribute, and that could be the number of investors needed could just be a very minuscule proportion of the
Yeah.
population. So capitalism, you can get a rocket ship company built if just maybe 1/10 of 1% of the people decide to invest in it, as opposed to the socialist economy where you have to have a majority vote to get the rocket ship plant built. Guess which one of these two is going to be the one that's going to more quickly build the rocket ship factory? You know what I mean? I feel like capitalism has an advantage there.
Um, yeah, it definitely could do. Um, Depends also at what cost that speed comes at.
That's true. It depends on how
You know,
expensive it's going to
you don't
be and
have,
so on.
yeah, you don't have to have a 51%, like you say, like a direct democracy type thing.
Hmm.
You can almost imagine it as just the workers electing their shareholders, if you like.
Hmm.
The workers electing a CEO. I personally don't care about hierarchies. You can have a boss who gives every command to all the workers, and there is no such thing as a middle management position
Hmm.
within your given company if you want. Um, but I think there's a major power, uh, a misbalance of power between the owner of capital and the person who works the capital.
Yeah.
And that puts the worker in a capitalist economy, puts the worker in a more precarious position
Hmm.
for the
Maybe
most
it does.
part.
It might put them more on their toes, I guess.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe, but that makes me feel like, oh, they just have to perform more. But I thought it was funny when you said that you don't necessarily have a problem with hierarchies. I'm assuming you mean like a voluntary consensual hierarchy, which I love hearing you say that. But it sounded kind of close to a capitalist figure of speech. It, look out, man! You might be a little bit capitalist somewhere in there. I've never heard a socialist say I don't mind hierarchies, or a communist say.
I don't listen.
It was good to hear.
I don't mind how, like, it's like with the vanguard. Anarchists argue all the time that, oh, the vanguard is, oh, it's authoritarian and it's da 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 da. Well, from my
Hmm.
perspective, that is a necessary hierarchy in order to actually achieve the goal you want.
Yeah.
So it's not that necessarily a boss is always unnecessary. In my experience, I work in the kitchen. I'm a KP.
Hmm.
Um, we It's vital that we have a hierarchy in the kitchen. It's
A voluntary
paramount. It
hierarchy
would
that
not
the
work.
workers agree to, right? That they agree to some degree of chain of command or direction of authority in a consensual
Yeah,
basis, right? And it's not like you're being forced to listen to the guy so
yeah,
much, not beyond like, well, I just want a job and I want to get a paycheck, but you
exactly.
you recognize there is value in having a hierarchical structure, at least to some degree, in a
Yeah,
workforce. Yeah,
of
that's
course,
good. That's
definitely.
great.
Doesn't always need to be,
Sure.
and that hierarchy can even be a democratic one. But
Sure. Yeah.
hierarchies are fine for them
Cool.
with me.
Well, you know what, man, I gotta tell you, I can't believe it's already been an hour and a half of us going back and
Wow.
forth. The time flies when I'm having good conversation, and the time flew
Hmm.
in this video. So I think we need to wrap it up now because it's getting a little bit long. But that was a lot of fun. I hope we do it again someday soon.
Yeah, man.
Before I wrap it up, do you want to have a final word or give just like have a quick say?
Oh man. Not really.
Not really. Yeah.
Not really, man. I'm good. Don't worry about it.
Cool. Great.
I'm trying
Great.
to think of some like "don't vote Biden" or some bullshit, but I don't give a fuck.
I just don't want to like say, well, that's it, and then cut you off. I want to give you a chance to have a final say. But if you said
Yeah,
your piece and you confessed to being okay with hierarchies, that was pretty cool. So,
yeah, man.
thanks so much, and I want to thank you again though for coming on to the show.
Of course.
Maybe we can talk about doing another episode sometime in the future if you're up for it. It was a real pleasure. I like your perspective.
Mm.
I hope I gave some challenging arguments or food for thought, and I feel like you gave me some interesting arguments as well.
I'm
Uh,
glad to hear, man.
yeah, and I want to thank all the viewers for watching the episode. Tell us what you think in the comments, and please like and subscribe. And I'll be putting up another debate video in the near future. So thank you everyone for joining us. And that's a wrap.